Okay, today is Tuesday, April 14th, and we're going to start learning about the biosphere today. So here we go. The biosphere contains all aspects of our world that has living things, which is pretty much everywhere. That could be in water, in the oceans and lakes and rivers, on land, even in places that we thought previously didn't have living things, like the deep ocean and hydrothermal vents and things such as that. So anywhere where there's something alive is part of the biosphere. If we look at the different levels of biological organization, of course, we could go down as far as individual cells, single-celled organisms like amoebas and things like that. Even within a single cell, if we looked at organelles and that sort of thing. But we're looking at a larger level here, starting with individual organisms. When we have a bunch of different individuals of the same species living in the same area, we now call that a population. And if you have different populations that are living together in a same area, that's a community. So you've got squirrels and chipmunks and birds, and they're all living in my backyard. So that would be a community. There's a diagram that kind of outlines what we're talking about here. You've got individuals of those same species in an area make a population, and then different populations make a community. Those different communities together, along with their non-living components, form an ecosystem. And then, of course, if we take a bunch of similar ecosystems, we get a biome. And then at the largest level, we have a biosphere, which includes, once again, any spot where things are alive. If we focus on ecosystems, an ecosystem includes both the living and non-living things in a particular environment. So those living things, the organisms and the food that they depend on, as well as their non-living components, the water, the air, things like that within that ecosystem. So those living things are called biotic factors. So a biotic factor is anything that is alive that factors into the overall characteristics of an organism, including what it eats, potentially its habitat. Abiotic factors are non-living parts of the environment. So those are things, as I said, that include, the air, the oxygen from the air, the water, the inorganic components of the soil. It could include factors such as pH, could involve factors such as temperature. All of those things are not living, but factor into the overall environment within that ecosystem. All right, biomes. So for your assignment that you're going to see, we're going to be looking at biomes. And biomes are a higher level classification that include a bunch of ecosystems that have similar climates within a certain area. So, for example, we could have the tropical rainforest. That is a biome. We don't have much of that in Canada, of course. We do have some rainforest out in British Columbia, but not tropical. Desert, things like the temperate forest, like we have here in London, Ontario. And of course, we could talk about the tundra up north, etc. Within any ecosystem, we have to look at how the energy moves. So the source of all of the energy originally is the sun. How does that energy that plants and other photosynthetic organisms get from the sun, how does that get distributed up the food chain all the way up to the top consumers? Well, let's take a look. So we have primary producers, and those are the photosynthesizers. So those are plants, those are what we used to call blue-green algae that we now call cyanobacteria because they're actually bacteria. Those are some single-celled protists, so some single-celled organisms like euglenas and things that have chloroplasts that are able to photosynthesize, that is, take the energy from the sun, use, of course, some carbon dioxide and water, and transform that into usable energy through making sugars for themselves so that their cells can respire. We also call these organisms autotrophs. Autotrophs, so trophic refers to feeding. So they automatically feed because they're able to take that energy from the sun and use it to make sugar, which they can then use for their cells for respiration. So that process, of course, is called photosynthesis. You talked about that probably in previous science classes or maybe even geography class back in grade 9. Uh, and that process, of course, it's more complicated than this, but the general process is for those plants or those bacteria, those photosynthesizing bacteria, through their chloroplasts, they're able to process carbon dioxide. They're able to use sunlight, and they need water. And in that process, a series of complex steps occurs. But in general, at the other end, they release oxygen and they produce sugar, glucose for themselves, which they are then able to use for cellular respiration, for their cells to do the work necessary for them to live. But there are also other organisms that are still autotrophs, but don't use the sun for energy, but rather use other chemicals, things like sulfur or even iron, for a process that's not photosynthesis, photo being the sun, but rather chemosynthesis, being other chemicals, as I said, such as sulfur or iron, being able to use that to process to eventually turn into energy so that they're usually single celled organisms so that those cells can respire. So those are really old bacteria called archaea or weird single celled organisms that live in deep hydrothermal vents and things like that that never see the sun. So those are things that are able to still be autotrophic, but instead of photosynthesis, they do something called chemosynthesis. Okay, so some photoautotrophs. Those are the more usual. Those are the green plants that you see there. Those are algae that you see covering the water there. All of those things, again, they contain chloroplasts and are able to take that energy from the sun and use it in order to create their own sugars so that those cells can respire, do the work that they need to. These chemoautotrophs, these are much weirder organisms. As you can see, these are ones that live in areas that are so far away, so deep down that they don't see the sun, so they need another way to create that energy. And yeah, they're usually weird looking things and often single celled organisms, archaea, really old bacteria, or things like deep sea worms that are able to get that energy from other chemical means, not using the sun. So, consumers, those are organisms that are unable to make their own food. So, that's you, that's me, that's your cat and dog. We can't photosynthesize, so we have to actually consume other organisms in order to get the energy that our cells need. So, we, as well, most of us anyway, are omnivores. Uh, if you eat, if you're a vegetarian, then of course you're a herbivore. But either way, you have to eat other organisms and break those down in order, using your digestive system, in order to turn them into simple sugars like glucose that your cells can then use for cellular respiration. That is to do the work necessary to keep you alive. So if you are not a producer, you are by default a consumer. That includes complex organisms like you and me and deer and rabbits, but also things like mushrooms, which are fungi. Herbivores, of course, those are plant eaters. They also include things that eat only algae. Um, we can think of many examples of those. If you eat meat, then you are a carnivore. Uh, for example, your cat is what's called an obligate carnivore, has to eat meat, cannot process vegetable matter, won't get the nutrition, does not have a digestive system suitable to get nutrition from plant matter. Of course, things like, sharks are another good example where they have to eat meat, would get no nutrition if they were to eat algae, for example. Omnivores, of course, eat both plants and animals. As I said, most human beings are omnivorous. Your cat isn't. Your dog is semi omnivorous, is able to uh, eat some plant matter, more so than your cat, in order to get some nutrition. Other examples, of course, are things like bears that rely often on berries and leaves and stuff, but also on fish, salmon, things like that. Oh, yeah, there's LeBron. Yeah, Gore Gudala. Okay. We don't often talk too much about detritivores. They're often kind of the unseen heroes of ecosystems. Those are the things that feed on dead organisms, dead plant or animal matter, and break them down and often return nutrients to the soil. And they're a very important component, even though they're often not really focused on in terms of, all the other organisms that exist within an ecosystem, as well as these decomposers, which again are there to take down any sort of, dead plant matter or plant matter that's fallen off, like tree leaves that fall off in the fall. They're able to break those down and take some of that energy that still exists in that dead plant or animal matter, and then return nutrients to the soil. Scavengers. So scavengers, I mean, they are carnivorous. They're still eating meat, but they don't actually go out and actively hunt and kill animals on their own. Not usually, anyway. Those are things like vultures that will take roadkill and other things that are dead. Obviously, still playing an important role in the ecosystem because they are taking that energy that still exists in those dead creatures and they are using it for themselves. You'll often find that some animals that are active hunters will also be scavengers, uh, sometimes even during the majority of their life, because it's much easier to catch dead things, as it turns out. Living things are fast. Okay, how does that energy that originally came from the sun and gets transferred into those autotrophs, into those photosynthesizing organisms, how does that make its way up the food chain? Well, the way it usually works is you get about 10% of the energy that exists in the things that you eat. So when, an elephant eats the vegetation that it does, it gets about 10% of the energy that existed in that vegetation because most of the energy went to the cells of that tree or the cells of that plant in order to do plant things, to grow, to reproduce. And some of that is also lost as heat. And there it is. So you only get about 10% of the energy that existed from what's called the trophic level below. So the first trophic level are those photosynthesizers, those autotrophs, also called primary producers. When you move up to the second trophic level, you get those herbivores, those things that eat the producers. Moving up again, you get animals that are now carnivores that were eating those herbivores, eventually leading to the top predator in an ecosystem, which if is often us if we're around, but if it's in more natural systems that don't include humans, if we didn't include humans in London, Ontario, it might be coyotes or hawks or eagles that are at the top of many of the ecosystems here. Yeah, I think I mentioned most of that. We can describe that flow of energy as it moves from those primary producers all the way up to the top consumer or top predator through food chains. And a food chain is simple in that it shows the direct link of that energy transfer. For example, you might get, um, well, my tulips, for example, get eaten by rabbits, and that rabbit might get eaten by a coyote, and that coyote probably doesn't get eaten by anything else. So that would be at the top. You might have grass that gets eaten by mice. Those mice get eaten by, say, oh, I don't know, a fox. And maybe that fox actually does get eaten by a coyote, in which case there's an extra step in that food chain. And that's what it looks like if we break them down and give them all titles. Primary consumers are the autotrophs. Those secondary consumers are the herbivores that eat them. Tertiary consumers are consumers that eat those secondary consumers. And then, of course, we can't forget those decomposers. Those are the things that break down dead organisms and recycle and return nutrients back to the environment. An example of some simple food chains right there. Of course, ecosystems are more complicated than that step-by-step food chain shows, and there are hundreds or thousands of possible food chains within an ecosystem, and those are described better by a food web. Food webs are obviously more complex, and if we were to do one of a natural ecosystem, even in London, Ontario, where most of our environment is disturbed by humans, it would include thousands of organisms if we looked at all the types of vegetation, if we looked at all the types of herbivores. Of course, getting fewer and fewer as we move up that pyramid to look at the carnivores and eventually to the top predator. Important to note that in these, the direction of the arrow points to the direction that the energy is transferred. So in this case, energy goes from those photosynthesizers, those primary producers, to the herbivores, then to those uh, consumers that eat the herbivores, eventually reaching the top. We can also describe this using a ecological or a trophic pyramid. And if we look at this trophic pyramid, as I said, each level you go up, you only get about 10% of the total energy from the level below. Where did again that 90% go? Well, it went, the organism used it in order to grow, in order to reproduce, in order to do all the vital things it needed to do, all the plant stuff that the plant needs to do to live. Some of it also just gets lost as heat. So that's why you can't have very many tertiary consumers compared with the number of primary producers that you have, because there's simply not as much enough energy available at those higher levels to have as many organisms. So at the top, you might only have one example of a top predator, or in an ecosystem, you might have a couple different ones, but there are always going to be far fewer hawks than there are mice, and far fewer mice than there are, individual grass plants, or shrubs, or bushes, or certain types of flowering plants. Because again, there's just not enough energy available as you continue to move up that trophic pyramid for the number of organisms to exist. So you have the highest number of organisms at the bottom of that trophic pyramid, and you also have the most energy and biomass at the bottom. Biomass being just the mass of all living things in that bottom of the pyramid, which includes primary producers. Here's an example that puts some numbers to it. The J there stands for joules. Joules are a unit of energy. We could have also used calories as an example, another unit of energy. And if you had 10,000 joules in primary producers in that daisy or whatever that flowering plant is there at the bottom, uh, only 1,000 joules of that is available to that next level, to those primary consumers. As you continue to move up from that 1,000 joules that was in that second trophic level there of primary consumers, only 100 joules is now available to those secondary consumers. Moving up once more, you get only 10 joules of energy in this, again, hypothetical ecosystem available to that top predator, which is a snake in this example, which shows why you can't have the same number of snakes as you had mice, can't have the same number of mice as you had grasshoppers or something like that, right? The lower down you are in that pyramid, the more number of organisms you can have and the more biomass that's available. Okay, that task is now being changed. So I'm actually going to go back one. I've altered the assignment uh, to turn it into a ArcGIS story map. So I'm going to post the instructions to that right now. You're going to create a story map. You're going to pick a biome in Canada, and I'll show you the ones available in the assignment. You're going to pick one of those biomes, and you're going to make a Esri story map, an ArcGIS story map that gives some information about that biome and also uh, provide some detail on how that biome is expected to change as climate change continues. So these biomes, the boundaries and what they consist of, are not static. They are changing as the climate changes. And some are expected to change significantly, while others maybe won't change quite as much. So look for the instructions on the classroom. And once again, if you have any questions, the best place to ask them are in the comments under the assignment in the classroom, because probably your classmates have similar questions and I can answer them there. But of course, you could also send me an email if you'd rather ask the question that way, and I will answer it as soon as I can. All right, hope everyone's safe. That's it for me.